last class we finished money. It's the actual currency that exists, what we use. Now we finished off. We talked about barter, which is totally useless. Then we went to specie money, gold, silver, stuff like that. And then we went to backed money, which is still run at the same time as specie money. Then went to fiat money. So the Federal Reserve, while it was formed during the period of backed money, as we're using gold and silver and backed money, the intent through many governments was the creation of the central bank to create fiat money for theoretically the good of the country. Now, at that time, the countryside was very narrow and thought, only of inflation, meaning I can pay back my loans cheap and not pay them back at all. That's what a lot of the farming population hoped to do, was to take out large loans, have inflation, eat away the money owed in the loans, and then not have to pay back much money. Because they thought of inflation as beneficial, which inflation stinks, particularly if you're in the working class and such. On the middle class, anyway, actually. Now, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. Now, all currencies are run by what's called a central bank. The Federal Reserve becomes the American central bank. That is the one that deals with the creation of money in the United States. Now, because the power of money, when you can create money, we create fiat money, which is what every country uses. Your government now has the ability to print whatever money it needs, which is, the word would be bad. How bad? Like, just sitting outside, well, as I said, swimming in gasoline while smoking, bad. Nothing good comes. You have to be very careful. Now, when the Fed was created, the United States, in general, is a culture speaking, a very paranoid culture. That is our culture. No, it's in the United States, when the government says do something, it'll be good for you, the Americans say, you're trying to scam me. Other countries, they salute and say, yes, sir. I'm not being cruel, anything like that. For example, difference between the United States and Canada, both of us come from English roots in terms of our design. The Canadians are loyal to their government. The Canadians can't fathom the idea that the government would do something bad. Whereas Americans, we view the government cynically. We revolted against our government because it was bad, so we believe government's going to be bad. That's part of our culture. And that runs the spectrum. It's funny seeing people who are hard communists and hard lefties in the United States saying, oh, the government's out to get us. The government's going to do this, going to do that. Trump should not have that power. In other words, they just, they'll be paranoid with the government. Now, they'll turn around when somebody likes it and say, oh, he should have all the power to do what he needs to do, especially get our enemies. But the whole point is in other countries, you don't get the anti-government spiel. You don't get the attack against the government per se. An attack against the politicians, yes, but not against the power of the government. Because the United States is basically, we are paranoids. We don't trust government with power. And creating money creation is very dangerous. So the Fed in the United States was highly restricted in what it may do. In other words, these Fed tools, these things done, they were really designed to keep the Fed from doing bad things. And other central banks can do really bad things, including the simplest one, printing money for the government to spend. Boom, they can do that. The United States Fed cannot do that. In fact, it was under the law that created the Fed. It was explicitly forbidden from giving printed money to the government. It was explicitly forbidden from directly buying bonds from the government. It was designed so the government would get no benefit, theoretically, from the creation of money. That way the government wouldn't have an inflationary bias. So these restraints put in. That's why it's one of the funny things, because of our paranoia, it made our Fed design the most efficient of central bank designs. The Fed objectives. And the Fed has several objectives, and none of these can be conflicting, depending on theory and such. One is the Fed is there to create good economic growth. The Fed is going to move things forward, power them, lead us forward to create high economic growth. That is one thing the Fed is hard to do. Create the conditions with monetary policy to accentuate or protect economic growth. Good make sense. Keep low inflation. Now that one is a difficult one because sometimes to create economic growth, I must risk inflation. But if we get high inflation, economic growth just went out the hopper. Now, I admit my idea of low inflation is zero, because then you cannot have another pay increase for the rest of your existence. But if inflation is zero, you're losing nothing. You are staying even. So low inflation, I think low inflation is being zero. In fact, if you're dealing with the poor and the middle class, to the poor, deflation, inflation going negative, is highly beneficial to them. Okay, we got those two. Keep a general stable money and economic system. Although in general, if the first two are happening, the third one's happening. It is keep my financial, my economic system stable so we don't blow a seal or something like that. Which when we talk about debt already, boom, blue seals. Wow, seal blowing, bad. You know what I mean? Did that. Well, we're doing that. Other countries have, not good. Again, the Fed was separated from the U.S. government to prevent the temptation of the government to create money to spend. In other words, the U.S. federal government to walk over the Fed and say, give me money, the Fed gives you money. The Fed just prints money and gives it to you. Which means that if there's more money chase the same amount of goods, which means we're toggled. Now, the Fed was so effective, it has been so effective, relative to every other central bank out there. In other words, the Fed is stunning compared to other central banks. So many other central banks have failed epically. That the Fed design was the design used for the creation of the Japanese central bank and the German Bundesbank, the German central bank, I should say. Like I said, the Bundesbank or something like that. I can't remember how to pronounce it. It was used for the creation of both of them. The Bundesbank and the Fed were both so effective that when the EU was created, the euro is running off a bank designed much like our Fed bank. So in other words, the creation of euros, I misplaced what I thought the mouse was, and yens, both are duplicating what's been done with dollars. Now notice that those are what? 3 of the 4 reserve currencies. Those are 3 of the 4 major reserve currencies used. And again, the Fed is made separate, just as the German central bank made separate, because they want to avoid this fear. Money creation for the government to spend, and the money creation for government to spend creates inflation. And again, inflation is bad. The worse inflation gets, the more ruthless it gets. We don't want that. Now, the Fed has a series of tools, a series of capacities used to inject money. The Fed is forbidden from directly giving money to the U.S. government. That way, the U.S. government doesn't say, I need to spend an extra trillion. Hey, Fed, just give me $1 trillion new dollars. That would be bad. So the Fed is denied that. Now, the Fed has several tools they can use. 3 of these have existed since the creation of the Fed. The 4th one is a new one. It was created a decade, like almost 20 years ago, around 2009, 2010. Let's do the first 3 and then the 4th one. Now, one is the discount rate. Discount rate is the Fed lending money to banks. And it was a discount rate. The Fed can say, I will lend you money. So when the Fed lowers the discount rate, let me change this thing. They say, hey, we're lowering the discount rate. Boom. Oh, I know it's being... Ooh, that was ugly. So lower the discount rate to here. That's shifting out the amount of money available because we're adding new money. The Fed is creating new money. In fact, you can argue, I'll put underneath this, that all this is new money. Because remember, the Fed pushes down the interest rate, the discount rate, to increase the level of investments. More money is available, high level investment in the economy. In fact, we're going to do the idea of money as a stimulus. We're going to go that way. This is a weak tool because we're making interest rates cheaper, but we can't make people borrow money. That's why it's called a weak tool. This is historical discount rate. And I point this out to show what has happened. And also, I admit I want to pick on the former Treasury Secretary, who's also a former Fed Chair, Janet Yellen. She said the Great Recession was due to this. That is, roughly speaking, the interest rate, discount rate. In fact, the discount rate when the Fed in that period was, I think, 6.7%. That's a high discount rate. Come up. Keep in mind, way over here, and these big bumps over here, we had heavy inflation at the times. In fact, the whole time period you had heavy inflation. And then reasonably tight money supply. Use the term reasonably limit. Now the Fed dropped the rate, even though the discount rate went down. We had, but the Fed now, so it was 6.7. Jay Yellen said the whole Great Recession because the Fed did cheap money. President Bush was doing cheap money for his friends. Oh, there was favoritism. Keep in mind, this is the same woman who was Treasury Secretary, organized the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank, $100 billion bailout to a mega bank that failed because it was stupid. While her and the Fed was saying, if you're some small bank, you won't get saved. It only apply to big banks that have connections to those who are powerful. Princess, Daddy's doing up a lecture right now. Daddy's doing a lecture right now, Princess. Silas, my youngest daughter, Charlotte. She's got disabilities, so you've heard her a few times. She's a cute little imp, but she's an imp at times. But she's like, oh, the Fed did this. When she was Fed chair, she had the discount rate down to 0.5%. In other words, she really pushed down discount rates so the government could have cheap money. We'll talk about that a little more as we go on. But in fact, because the government needed cheap money to spend a lot. The next one is open market operations. Now, by law, the federal government is forbidden, by law, the federal government is forbidden, I should say, reverse, strike it. By law, the Fed is forbidden to buy bonds directly from the U.S. government. It's not allowed to do that. That was made negative because the U.S. government could print, the Fed could print money and just give it to U.S. government by buying bonds. Now, the Fed is allowed to buy bonds. In fact, restrictions, bonds about the only security the Fed can buy. It's not allowed to buy stocks. It's not allowed to buy bonds of other companies, stuff like that. It can buy currencies of other nations and other countries' government bonds. It's only basically restricted buying government bonds, the buying and selling of government bonds. That's why open market is when the Fed goes and says existing holders of bonds, not the government. We are going to buy them from you and give you dollars. So when the Fed buys bonds from people in the private sector, well, that ain't gonna work. When they buy bonds from people in the private sector, it is removing, bonds, but it's giving what? It's giving money. It's putting more money out there, and theoretically freeing up resources for more investment, more production, more building. And so when the Fed wants to expand the money supply, it buys bonds and it prints money to give them. When it wants to decrease the money supply, it does the reverse. It sells bonds to pull up cash, eliminate the cash. The Fed is, again, forbidden to buy private sector stocks and bonds explicitly because the potential for the corruption was. The Fed does tens of billions of dollars of sales buying and selling every day. In other words, the Fed, because the Fed can print money, it could take over through printing money any major corporation wanted. The potential of insider trading information would be stunningly huge. And so we say, no, we're going to restrict that. Now, in 2010 to 2016, the Fed did buy, and did again in 21 to 24, a lot of, equity in private firms, which was illegal. It was explicitly illegal. Okay, and on this point, I apologize. But again, the Fed is forbidden to buy private sector stocks and bonds and may not buy bonds from the government. Now, these laws, in fact, I was picking on Janet Yellen, who was Treasury Secretary before she was chair of the Fed. She broke these laws. Now, these laws were not changed. She just arbitrarily decided, well, I'm just so brilliant, I can do this. She actually bought private sector securities and financial firms to save them, all of them, with giant firms, multi-billion-dollar firms, and all of them had connections to her. And it was and this is a danger. What's happening? There was the Fed was becoming that which people who opposed the Fed said was going to become an institution of the powerful for the powerful, which is again utopian economy because all the big firms will seek the succor of the Fed, and the Fed has already told little firms, we just want you to die. Which not to do. Okay, the third part of the Fed was called the reserve requirements. This is the Fed, setting how much money banks must keep in either their vaults or the Fed just in case. The Fed would be like, we have to keep so much money available to be used. And that way banks won't have a run because they always have cash on hand. So if you had, let's just say, well, it doesn't show very well. Let's shift to drawing, and we'll go back to yellow because it shows well. If you have, let's say, $1 billion in the vaults, and there's a 10% reserve requirement, $1 billion in deposits, 10%, a 10% reserve requirement means you must have $100 million in the vaults. 10% of money is either in the vault or at a Fed bank. Now, since money can be instantly transferred and stuff like that electronically, having money at the Fed bank was always secure. Fed banks do not get robbed. Robbing a Fed bank is like going into a gun show with guns and saying, stick them up, this is a robbery. Every gun show's going to say, finally! And then all going to be walking up to the dead bodies. People came to, rob them and say, who got that hole? Who got that hole? Who got that hole? That'd be what it's like robbing a Fed bank. You don't rob a Fed bank, You just, I think it's happened like twice in U.S. history or something like that. And usually covertly, like no one come in saying they're robbing it. They try to penetrate it or stuff like that. It is, literally speaking, it is a vault. It is a fortress. And so that's why they'll keep the Fed bank for security. Now, this one is what's called the most powerful tool because it sets the flow mechanic of money. It sets the maximum velocity of money. In other words, what's called the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. That's why it's called the most powerful tool, because the Fed can immediately either tighten the money supply and slow down the flow of money, or loosen the reserve requirement and increase the flow of money. So before, see, 1 over, like, if the reserve requirement was 10%, 1 over 10 would be the money multiplier was 10. Each dollar will flow, exchange hands, like it was $10. Right? And if the reserve requirement were lowered, so say I'm going to be easy on my head, say 5%, then each dollar would act like it was $20. And that's what's called the money multiplier. Now, money can go slower than this rate, and it has, which we're, grateful for, thank God. But so, the reserve requirement, it determines, so the Fed can use this to immediately change this. So if the Fed lowered the reserve requirement from, 10 to 8, and you've got $40 trillion in banks, all of a sudden, every bank has an extra 2% of money it can lend. It does not sound like much, but think about 40 trillion in deposits and you get an extra 2%. That means an extra $800 billion can now be lent immediately. Or reverse it. The Fed tightens up, raises the reserve requirement. Every bank has to be calling in loans and not lending for a little while because they can do what? They've got to deal with the tight money. They've got to adjust and deal with, the hard point it has. And so that is a very powerful tool. This is what a lot of times I call this the chainsaw of Fed tools. The Fed uses this tool when they want to make a heavy statement. And literally speaking, they want to make a heavy statement. They use this tool. And not being cool or anything like that. It's due to the fact that this tool is a killer. Now, these three tools, when I was young, these are the three tools I learned. That was it. In the early teens, 2010, the Fed created a new tool. This one always theoretically existed, but we never thought about it because it was never used. This is interest on reserve balances. The Fed started paying interest on excess balances. The Fed. Now, see, before the Fed would say, "Hey, remember you keep 10% of money." Now, a lot of banks will put extra reserves. Now, excess reserves usually nothing big. For example, 2007, there was zero excess reserves. In other words, banks had no extra money on hand because extra money on hand doesn't do anything for me. It's in my vault doing nothing, so I'd like to lend it out, earn a return, and make money. Well, the Fed was printing about an extra, 30 to $50 billion a month to help finance government spending. Now, it can't directly give to the government, but the government floats the bonds into the open market. The Fed goes to the open market and buys the bonds, keeps interest rate down, and soaks up those bonds. That was one way. So the Fed was basically injecting, I said, between 40 and 60 billion dollars of money a month. That is going to cause serious inflation. Well, the Fed didn't want serious inflation because the country doesn't want it. So the Fed started doing what's called, to mitigate the impact quantitative easing. The Fed started paying interest on banks putting money in the Fed vault, putting extra money in the Fed vault. This was done with the idea of soaking up that surplus money. So the excess reserves should have been 50 because before they didn't pay any interest, didn't have to. You had to be in your vault at the Fed Bank. We're not going to pay you when you go beyond what you're supposed to have by the reserve requirement. We'll pay you interest. So a lot of U.S. banks were putting money in the Fed because they got a safer, better return than investing in the economy, or even they got a better return than buying U.S. government bonds. Now, when the Fed got that money, the Fed go buy government bonds too, with the excess reserves and such. And so we went from zero excess reserves to over $4 trillion by 2022. And the Fed is also, because of excess reserve, holding out $3 to $4 trillion in government bonds. So we've created a dangerous bubble because if the interest rate ever rises, keep in mind the Fed's paying on this $4 trillion, the Fed may be paying 2%. When the interest rate goes to 3, 4, 5%, the Fed's got to pay 3, 4, 5% to keep those excess reserves in. Otherwise, banks will pull them from the Fed, and when they pull them from the Fed, all that money goes in the economy and triggers high-level inflation fast. Now, a lot of people call for the Fed are basically just saying the government has to pay back the bonds because the Japanese Fed did it. And the U.S. Fed could do that because the government doesn't really care if it's getting paid back. And the people who bought them, lent the government some money or get their money back when the Fed bought the bonds. So let's talk to that. But then the next idea of the Fed just forgiving the bonds they hold, or the Fed just keep buying bonds to buy up the U.S. debt and wipe it out. Remember, to buy the whole U.S. debt, $39 trillion, the Fed will have to print $35 trillion worth of bonds. That's brutal. Okay, then raises the question of monetary theories. What are the monetary theories? How does money affect the economy? Because talk about we've been creating money, saying what money can do. The question goes, okay, how does money affect the economy? And this is where swimming in gasoline comes in. Swimming in gasoline while smoking comes in. You do it wrong, you don't get a dumpster fire, you get a gas explosion. Bad things happen. People get burned. Not being cruel here. So we've given the government the power to create money out of thin air. A very dangerous situation. What rules apply to fiat money? How will money affect? What constraints does it face? These things come in. The theories say, how will these things happen? And so this is the money equations. That's the monetary equation. This is pure reality. This is a pure positive. You cannot defy this. A lot of people say, I don't like this. It shouldn't be this way. Irrelevant. What this equation says, there is a balance between the money balances side here and the real balances side, which is here. Those two will stay. They must stay in balance. All I'm saying is the amount of money in existence being used any time is equal to the amount of the economy being generated. Because we were buying stuff with money, stuff like that. It should be a pure balance between it. And the equation will seek a pure balance. That's a pure positive. Going against it, saying this doesn't real, it doesn't hold, never ends well. Because it is reality. In other words, this is not a theory, it is reality. Theory figured out, oh, this is how reality works. Now, theories will impose conditions on this equation, which they can hold, just usually not permanently. Okay, let's deal with this equation. M is the money supply. That's the actual amount of money in circulation. In 2008, the United States had $1.2 trillion in circulation. By 2020, we had $5.2 trillion in circulation. By 2024, I think it was like $7.4 trillion in circulation. Money can be created very quickly. So the money supply is one item there. Then there's the velocity. Velocity is the rate at which money goes through the system. In other words, that's the rate at which money goes through the system. How fast does it move? Now, if we look at this historically, velocity, they notice I said, remember, the money multiplier made the maximum rate of velocity. Velocity could be slower. Now, velocity is the habits of the population as such. The population financial sector, they tend to be basically balanced. Even when we had inflation, we had it reasonably balanced. A little jack up in the late 70s, like that, but basically, the velocity might say people didn't change their pattern too much. It wiggled, but it's right. Then the 90s, the movement of money increased. Then you see to be a return to lower items in the early teens. Then you had the Great Recession, and velocity fell. Now, part of the fall of the velocity of money, remember, is due to the fact of the government engaged, not the quantitative easing, but the excess reserve policy. The government was soaking up, slurping in that money back to itself, to the Fed, to keep it from moving. Again, if we ever had inflation, that money would all release out of the Fed because the private banks would take the money back. They'd release it because getting 2% from the Fed, when I have 10% inflation, means I'm losing money. They'd pull out and put in something else. And so the Fed has to jack what they're paying those interest rates. Okay, so M times V, money times velocity, is called the money balance equation. That was just the cash used to buy things. M can move very, very fast. It's going to be creating money. And even velocity can move very fast and change. It often doesn't. It tends to be rather stodgy, but it can change. This side of the equation can go real fast. Remember, money is the representation of wealth, income wealth generated. It's not income wealth in and of itself, although a lot of people in government, a lot of people in academia think, we'll just create money and make everybody rich. Did you change anything real? Nope. But they think they can do it. You know, because they want to be that way. Real balances. Now, the real balances side is the other side of the equation. How is the other side of the equation doing? What kind of impacts is having? This is called the real balances side. Now, P is prices or inflation. Now, inflation we dealt with already. That's the rise in prices every year. Inflation can be low, but inflation can change and move very fast. In fact, this cartoon for 2022, when our inflation rate officially got to 9% and change, unofficially, people believe it may have been 15 to 20%. It's just, remember, the Fed took things out again during, in those Yellen's successor, Powell, took things out of the inflation, mechanism. So did Yellen as, Treasury Secretary, in order to make it look not as bad. But even doing that, inflation was bad. That's why I said, you hear something, new. Nah, it's just a win. Because inflation would be like a giant Bruin, a giant bear, those big Kodiak grizzlies coming up, and you're inside that little tent that's saying, hello, lunch. And there's reasons people my age and older hate inflation, having lived through heavy inflation. No common people like inflation. Your elites will like inflation a lot of times. The powerful, mighty, they will like inflation, not the average people. So we got prices that can move very quickly. Then there's real GDP. Real GDP is very slow because that is the actual production of goods and services. In other words, more goods and services must be produced, must be generated, must be delivered. This takes time. By its nature, this is a slow entity. The government can print, $1 trillion a day easily. Boom. Velocity can change. Boom. Price can go. Boom. Production of extra goods, that takes time. They have to be made. They have to be produced. They have to be generated. This is a very slow creature. It does not move on a dime. So PY is the real balances side. Price times price the goods, inflation and the goods. This will always stay in balance. It must always stay in balance. It does stay in balance, or a breakdown occurs. This is a positive rule in the economics of monetary theory. It is an absolute. You cannot defy it. People do that occasionally. No. It is set. So then that leads to the question of, what is creation of money, which is what the Fed really controls. It can adjust the velocity and stuff like that. What is the creation of money? Oh, heck, what is creation of money? Oh, now my mouse pad's being a little twiggy. I need a vacuum mouse pad. Oh yeah, and when I take my finger off it, what is the creation of money, which the Fed controls, impact it has on the economy? When we cause economic growth, we cause high inflation. Except for a few screwballs, nobody wants higher inflation. Again, among the elite of the elite, higher inflation can benefit them by hurting everybody else. And those usually people connect with the government because they can get the deals. Stimulate the economy. What's called, it's not called monetary policy or neo-Keynes. They put neo-Keynes. And so, again, I'm using this term because they worry about inflation less. Now, in this one, and keep in mind that other people say, okay, the equation looks like this. What the Keynes say is the equation, velocity is sticky. So velocity is sticky. It won't change, but it tends to be sticky. And prices are sticky because you may be in a very competitive economy and or both a recessionary economy, which firms don't want to raise prices because they might get hurt. The consumers will buy from somebody else. So those two tend to be sticky. Now, sticky does not mean locked. It means sticky. You do something too stupid, you can loosen it. But it gives you the potential of engaging in a monetary policy. They never let me see it. I'd love to do white. Let's see. Of increasing my money supply. Well, that's a little bit much, but I meant to increase my money supply a little bit. And my mouse pad is being very unresponsive today. And increasing the real GDP. But you have to do it a little bit. I had the giant arrow. Wasn't meant to be a giant arrow. Meant to be a teeny arrow. In fact, you know what? I can hit that erase and I'm going to wipe out that arrow. Well, on this arrow too. There we go. Turn the light. See, we have a little increase in my supply, which causes increased velocity. The other two tend to stay sticky. So it's not having that impact. So because it's sticky, increasing my money supply by a reasonable amount. Well, now keep in mind, money supply, and this is the beautiful thing, why a lot of people duplicate the Fed structure. money is injected on average. The government gets in line, takes a lot of it, into the financial sector. Money injected in the financial sector may lower the interest rates, cause the level of investment in the economy to be higher. Higher levels of investment expand the frontier. Expand the frontier will increase the stickiness of prices, push prices down, and thus you can what? You can benefit from it. So velocity can be very, I apologize, not velocity, but because those two are sticky, we can achieve it. Now and that's a win-win because there's nothing about. And so now my thing is not more money; it's to cause more economic growth because the money supply lowered the interest rate. Interest rate meant private sector can engage in more investment. More investment means more resources, more technology, more capital, and all those things push out supply curves and relieve inflationary pressure, which means if we do this properly, we can win. That's why a lot of people, support this. Now, this is just an example in terms of what's happened in the last, 16 plus years is the government has taken all that increase in money. Now, it did keep us from having death spiral when the Fed was taking all the noise. We engaged this policy to stimulate the economy, but I should call it the federal government sucked up all the extra money created. So instead of going to private sector and causing economic growth, it fed the government. And remember, we had that liability of all that money, surplus reserves in the Fed that could be released. But its primary purpose was not so much to stimulate the economy as much as it was feeding the government so the government could spend what they wanted to. In fact, I had mentioned before, when President Biden was president, when interest rates were low because the Fed was being cheap with money, the U.S. could have taken at that time all $33 trillion, $34 trillion worth of debt, rolled it over into 20-year bonds, not 6-month bonds, which is where the average was, 20-year bonds. We would have been paying 1% instead of the 0.4%, but it would have been locked in at 1%, 33. But what the government wanted to do is instead of the government paying what would have been about $600 billion in interest payments, the government wanted to pay 280, and then have that extra $300 billion to spend on other stuff. And so that's what the government did. Of course, inflation did happen, rates did go up, and we're spending over $1 trillion on interest payments, but we could have had locked in 600 and then another maybe 50 to 100 billion dollars. But instead, having to pay higher interest rates has caused us to borrow more money to pay off the money we've already borrowed. Now, new class, because again, we talk about quantitative easing. They look and say we didn't even get the growth rate because it's cheap money because the government sucked up the growth rate. And the government made interest rates so cheap that risk could not be accounted for. And the government wanted it. In other words, the government, and some people say the Fed, wanted the money so cheap so the government could borrow money cheap and keep spending. But when you have low interest rates, if there is risk in the economy, which there was because we had low growth, the private sector does not borrow as much. In other words, we may have been better served in the teens if our interest rates, instead of being held artificially low, with the Fed keeping like 0.5%. If they relied to rise to 3%, I would have been killed by interest payments. But our private sector may have grown next to 1 or 1.5% because the risk would have been accounted for. It's hard to beat low risk loans when you have risk to stuff you want to borrow. This is one I grew up with. It's called the inflation trap. In fact, this is one that's interesting. It's what's called the experience of the Phillips curve, and this was developed in the 1970s. Has a theory. In other words, reality shows how something works. Before this point, there was belief in the Phillips curve, in which you have a long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In other words, that could lower my unemployment rate by printing money. And if I wanted, low inflation, I'd have low inflation, but I'd have, higher unemployment. That kind. They thought there was that trend. And so Now with this one, MV equals PY, and prices are sticky for the moment. In other words, I didn't even put the full sticky in there because they still wiggle. They just need to see. In other words, you could be in a competitive environment which firms will change prices in response to costs and stuff like that, but they need to see the price rise first, so there's a delay. So the Fed could print money, not cause, it's going to keep a little glowy thing, print money. It might trick the firms into producing a little more extra output because they'll think people are demanding more of my goods, it's not inflation. But they produce more goods, they're losing money in those goods because there's inflation higher than they thought, and they cut back. So we have a creation of a stepping system in which the creation of money, the printing of money, creates a short-term fix in the economy, a short-term high, where people are going like, oh, feel the rush, ooh, but then they crash. But when they crash, inflation is permanently raised because people realize they were tricked. In other words, the government creates a small high that makes it seem like the economy is doing better, so output increases. We say, well, that's good. Saying, yeah, but see, the firms are actually losing money on the extra output, so you're causing more firms to potentially fail. So you have to cut back. Except for they do cut back because the output falls back down. I don't get that, but you did permanently increase the inflation rate, and that's a killer. Because see, nothing real. As they point out, nothing real has changed. The government creates extra money. Nothing real has changed the economy. In other words, that's why we talk about stimulant. We want what? The discount rate to go down for the sake of the private sector so they engage in more operations because they get cheap interest rates and they can engage in more productive operations. Here we're printing more money just to feed the government, which is what we're doing in both cases. But then nothing real changed, so the firms adjust to the fact that I have more money chasing the same, more dollars, more money chasing the same amount of goods. It's just going to create inflation. But you get a short-term high. And governments go for that short-term high because they well, it'll be all great. And so you get this one. This is an adjustment. I'm being simple here. This is an adjustment of the Phillips curve. The adjustment of the Phillips curve. Now, all those little curves are short on the Phillips curve. So what would occur? And again, I'm going to use the lighty thing. Like through the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, inflation in the United States was about 1%. Not zero, but one. Okay, it's easy function. Then the government says, "Well, I want, unemployment down." So the government printed money and caused inflation. Then inflation went to 2%. But then people realized inflation's 2%, not one. They expanded output because they thought inflation was 1%. Any increase in sales or prices was due to consumers demanding their goods when it wasn't happening. So they adjusted. But then the government comes 18 months or 2 years later saying, "Oh, I need the economy stimulated, so we're printing more money to get the inflation rate to 3%." And then they adjusted to it. Notice each time the curve's getting steeper and they're getting a higher and higher base inflation rate. As your inflation rate goes over 5% and then goes to 6, 7, 8, 9%, stuff like that, it actually causes unemployment to rise because inflation creates costs. From all the uncertainty costs we talked about today, inflation increases uncertainty costs, the cost of making mistakes. People tend to discount a lot of times. You say, no, some increasing cost in the economy, which makes the thing bend back. In other words, your class could say when you're sitting there, because we have this is empirically proven in the 70s. So in the 60s, 70s, the United States, the Japanese, the Europeans, they all had been playing with this for the 60s, saying, see, it works. Not even realizing you moved your inflation rate from 1.5% to 1%, all the way to 3 or 4 or 5%, thinking, oh, it's all working because you're not feeling the inflation, but you're generating costs. But then they started pushing inflation, we get to 7, 12, 18. And so it was getting high. By the time I got 19, when it was nearly 20% a year, we had to really tighten the money supply to break inflation. The fact is by 1982, inflation was down to 3%. The Fed kept money tight, exceptionally so. The reason I know it now is there was a big debate then. Is the Fed being too far tight? Alan Volcker, the chair of the Fed, Paul Volcker, my bad. Paul Volcker, some poor guy named Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed, said, "No, inflation is there. The deficits of the Reagan administration are so horrible. He is forcing me to keep the money supply tight because it'll all fall back because he's a spendthrift." Okay, now he said this repeatedly. He said, "Well, you got to raise taxes. You got to squeeze the economy, otherwise we are dead." I know I'm being mean here. No, not really. Now, where's my little thing go? Oh, that's just being. I don't think my thing wants to talk to me. Yo, 3%. It was Reagan's deficit with 3% of the economy. President Obama, President Biden got deficits over 10% of the economy. Paul Volcker said in those times, when the debt was big as a percentage of GDP, no, we must have the cheap money. Only cheap. So that tells you right then, when he was chairman of the Fed, and he said the rates need to be raised, he was trying to destroy the economy, because if deficits of 3% were bad, deficits of 10% are worse. But 10% he wanted more cheap money. At 3%, it's gotta be tight, the world will end. So it tells me in the sense of, he is intentionally trying to destroy the economy in the early 80s, trying to break it, and it wasn't proven until the empiricals of the teens. The other reason I say that is Volcker is one of these, big ego men. He never admitted he was wrong here. He said, "Oh yeah, doing here, cheat my Oh no, here was also right because Reagan was too dangerous. He was doing too dangerous. His debt was going to destroy the world." Well, a smaller debt to GDP than we have, and it was less borrowing as GDP. How's that more dangerous? And it's just the fact that he wanted to destroy the administration. I'm being mean. No, not being mean. That's actually that's when you caught him. It's only unethical. It's you're any government agency. You're the government agency. I live for the betterment of the nation. Period. My whole existence is for the betterment of the population. That's what I do. When you're the government, your entire purpose is to see the population better off. You engage in policies will hurt the population. You do not do that. But a lot of times governments will do that as long as it benefits the governments. Or, as I picked on Yellen, and I get stuff up on Volcker right now, so I'm forgetting the now I'm looking at share Fed. I apologize. I'll have to know. No, Walsh is the new one. Who was the one before that? Paul. I go Paul. I said Paul. I can remember. But Paul was the reason when he intentionally, they intentionally gained it. That's unethical. Okay, let's deal with so that's why, the new classics view inflation and view monetary policy as a trap, because you may get this short-term inflation trap. They're not saying you can't have the monetary stimulation. They believe the monetary stimulation needs to happen in an economy, in a Fed economy, when things are going fine. In other words, when you have surplus resources, when you have, tight competition, when there is no danger of inflation. Otherwise, you run into the inflationary trap, and governments like getting those quick fixes. They keep jacking up slightly, and they keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and then you get what? You get tagged out. Horrible. Now we go to truly being, while basically swimming in gasoline while smoking. A horrible situation. Do not do it. Hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is evil. This is horrible. Governments that engage in hyperinflation should be flogged. In fact, the former El Presidente of Venezuela, Maduro, the guy in the little picture, and Venezuelans don't even mind that he's gone. In fact, he once said, "I dare Trump to come and get me," and Trump snagged him. I think probably the Venezuelan people just said, he's the big guy over there. The only person in the country's got the bat because he did this to the country. And so hyperinflation is when prices are rising 100% plus a year. It's a catastrophe for the economy. There is only one cause for hyperinflation. One. You'll hear lots of the government prints money to spend. That's it. There is no other cause. People act like, oh, it's a crisis. No. There is never a reason for the government to print money to spend. That is what's called bad. Immensely bad. And so where do you get it? The government prints money to spend. This is the German hyperinflationary spree of the 1920s, the end of the First World War, beginning of the First World War, going up into the 20s. You notice that's accelerating. That is a logarithmic scale. In other words, at the top you've got there's a trillion. Yeah, that's a trillion, a net trillion. In other words, by the time you get to the end of the hyperinflationary spree, one mark, one gold mark of 1913 traded for a trillion Weimar marks. And the government just dumps money in the system. When the government dumps money in the system, go back to the equation. The only thing that the government's dumping money in. Oh, you're going to be a poogie again. The government's dumping in money. The only thing that can keep up with this money is prices, inflation. In fact, when the government does that, inflation is now rising fast. The government dumping money, creating that inflation as such, notice causes the economy to shrink because there's cost to inflation. So the economy shrinks, the economy goes down. Now think about it, stays in balance. So money goes up by, just say, 1,000%. The economy shrinks by 5%. Now the inflation, to keep the two sides in balance, the inflation is actually rising faster than money creation. Now, usually when the government creates and prints money, its general objective is for the government to live well, to keep the government, because the government wants to spend money. The government needs to spend money. In fact, when the Greeks had their financial crisis, the general belief was the Greeks were having this financial crisis because the Greeks said, we get a credit card from Europe. In fact, the Germans said when Greece joins, they imposed a lot of restrictions in the EU treaty to make sure countries would not, basically try to free ride. Countries went to free ride. And people have like, oh, we didn't know countries would free ride. Really? 1991, 92, the treaty designing, the Maastricht Treaty designing it, reams of Germans, Dutch, and lots of other economists saying, this is going to happen. You're creating this hazard. But see, let's just go with hyperinflation. That's stage one hyperinflation. So the government's printing money to keep up, keep up with inflation, but inflation now goes faster than the money. So government's money starts losing its trade. Now, the first trade money loses is store of value. The store of value means the investment sector disappears in the economy. The investment sector in the economy disappears. It dissolves. It goes away. You lose your investment sector. Because my money won't keep value. Store value is I'm putting my money in the bank, in the economy, stuff like that, so it can increase and gain value. Except for money keeps losing its value. So money leaves. Your investment sector dries up. Now, the government likes this. Private sector investments go away. Everybody buys government bonds. The government can try to get things cheaper and stuff like that. But your investment sector economy really disappears. And so the economy grows slower. here's a fun one. People say about the U.S. government was trying to help the Argentinians budget up the peso at 1,420 to the dollar. And that was in last November. In 2000, the peso was 1 to the dollar. In other words, if in the late 90s, 2000, 1 peso got you $1. Now, 1,400 pesos get you $1. That is all the government printing money. The government's printing money so the government can spend. Now, so they got hyperinflation. Now, in fairness, over the last year and a half, since changed governments, their inflation rate went from 250, 300% to about 12% because the Argentinians did what? They cut government spending. They went, so everybody who's not working for the Argentinian government is actually doing pretty good. I'm an Argentinian farmer. I'm doing great. I'm an Argentinian, clothing manufacturer. I'm doing good. I'm an Argentinian cattleman or shepherd. I'm doing good. If I was somebody who's feeding at the Argentinian government trough, I'm suffering because the government's not giving me free money anymore. So you lost store value. Now, when you get to this stage, I'm just using arrows to be simple. Money supply is increasing faster because the government's going to increase the money supply to keep up with inflation, which is rising faster. Right? Because increasing money supply keep up with inflation. But inflation rises faster than money supply. Because remember, Y is shrinking, it's going to stay in balance. So the government prints even more money. But as the government does that, everybody realizes, if I'm sitting on money, I'm losing value. Go that peso example. You're losing. If you have money in pesos, you're losing money immediately. People leave. In other words, the velocity of money increases. When you have inflation of just say 1% a day, which without compounding is 365 a year, probably about 400% plus inflation a year. Just holding your money for a day means in the morning your dollar bought $8 worth of good. In the evening it bought 99 cents. Tomorrow it'll buy 98 cents. By the end of the week it'll borrow 93 cents. It'll buy 93 cents. What does everybody do with their money once they get? They dump it. They get rid of cash as fast as possible. So velocity rises. But now you may have a 5 here. Oops, no, that. If sorry, it's trying to do one of those things where, you want something? No, I just want to draw 5. You get 5. But now my velocity used to be a 1. Now it's a 2. My GDP used to be a 1. Now it's, give me a boogie. Now it's a 0.8. So it used to be 5 times 1 and 5 times 1. But now it's 5 times 2 because my velocity is faster. So 5 times 2 is 10. But my Y, my 1, my output shrank because of all the negative consequences. So now it's 0.8. So I must have like 12.5 times 0.8 to equal that. So my inflation rate is 12. My money creation is only 5. My inflation is 12.5. Rising immensely faster than my money supply. But the government's going to print even more money because the government agencies have to feed well, because government can't suffer. If government suffers, the world's going to end. Everybody else the government can squeeze, not self. They'll print even more money. That's why in the previous thing you saw that German graph go, because they were doing that. Now, as this stage happens, money begins to lose its second trait. We lost store value, we lose unit of account. Because how do I keep my books when money's, what does money mean anymore? Its value is constantly changing. All it's doing is inflating. It's buying less and less. I can't use money to use my books anymore. Without knowing if I'm making money or not, I will fail. So I lose my unit of account. I lose my capacity to produce things. That causes Y to shrink even more. Y shrinks even more, it causes inflation better because I have lots of money chasing fewer and fewer goods. People trying to get rid of money as fast as possible. All those things put upward pressure on prices. It's calling you in a death spiral downward because the government's being stupid. At this stage, prices are insane. You're talking inflation rate of $1 million% a year or something like that, or 10 million or 20 million, or huge numbers. Now at this stage, the government has two choices. I can either go towards collapse, which is what Somalia, Libya, other places have done, South Sudan. You have a government on the map, Haiti, but it doesn't really exist. It's just ruled by street gangs. Oh, sure, foreign money may give the theoretical government that exists money, but your country's run by street gangs. So you must either A, collapse, bad, or B, reform the currency and never do it again. Germany, after its hyperinflation from a few slides ago, said, we were wrong, we were bad, we will never do this again, it is bad, and so the Germans said, we won't do it again. Even the Nazis did not create hyperinflation because they're like, people don't like hyperinflation. And Nazis didn't care about anything. I'm not being mean, I'm just saying, they're psychonauts. But, Germany didn't even do that. Now, a lot of times, governments will replace the currency and they'll do the same thing again. Argentina in the 70s through the 80s replaced their currency 5 times. In fact, they've been so bad that the first hyperinflation took like Argentina 5 to 6 years to break things down. The last one before it happened, the last one of the 80s, took them 18 months. And so in other words, people knew what the government was doing again, they accelerated. That's why during the 90s, they locked it. In fact, a number of people in the 90s said, Argentina, give up your currency. Dollarize your economy. Hey, say the US dollar is the currency for Argentina and call it a day. You don't have inflationary problems. It's the Argentinian government did not want to give up the power to create money. You mentioned went to currencies. Many countries just they'll keep running the risk of collapse or resetting the currency, trying again, because the idea of the government being on a diet, the government not spending money, is anathema to them. The government must live and do well. That's why you can look at many countries all over the world. Not even, not at least in Washington, D.C. And you notice the capital city is always richy, glitzy, looks beautiful. The rest of the country, dirt poor. Because the government officials all want to live well. They're not worried about the population. And so that's the end of this section. You guys have all been good. I apologize for being, I don't apologize for being over the top. I love being over the top.